The provisional government, led by Prince Lvov, was the old Duma in a new form. When Paul Mikhailov, the foreign minister, read out the list of ministers in the newly formed government, someone in the listening crowd called out, "Who appointed you lot then?" Mikhailov replied, "We are appointed by the revolution itself." In that exchange were expressed the two crippling weaknesses of the provisional government throughout the 8 months of its existence. It was not an elected body. It had come into being as a rebellious committee of the old Duma, refusing to disband at the Tsar's order. As a consequence, it lacked legitimate authority. It had no constitutional claim upon the loyalty of the Russian people and no natural fund of goodwill on which it could rely. It would be judged entirely on how well it dealt with the nation's problems. The provisional government's second major weakness was that its authority was limited by its unofficial partnership with the Petrograd Soviet. It was not that the Soviet was initially hostile. Indeed, at first there was considerable cooperation between them. Some individuals were members of both bodies. For example, Alexander Kerensky, the Social Revolutionaries' leader, was for a time chairman of the Soviet as well as minister of the provincial government. The Soviet did not set out to be an alternative government. It regarded its role as supervisory, checking that the interests of the soldiers and the workers were fully understood by the new government. However, in uncertain times that followed the February Revolution, the provincial government often seemed unsure of its own authority. This uncertainty tended to give the Soviet greater prominence. There was also the impressive fact that in the aftermath of the February Revolution, Soviets were rapidly set up in all major cities and towns of Russia. Yet, although the Soviets were to play an increasingly important role in the development of the revolution, in the early stages the Bolsheviks did not dominate them. They were not, therefore, necessarily opposed to the provincial government. It was significant, however, that even before the Bolshevik influence became predominant, the ability of the Petrograd Soviet to restrict the provisional government's authority had been clearly revealed. In one of its first moves as an organization, it had issued its Soviet Order Number 1, which read, "The orders of the Military Commission of the State Duma are to be obeyed only in such instances when they do not contradict the orders and decrees of the Soviets." What this order meant was that the decrees of the provisional government in regard to military affairs were binding only if they were approved by the Petrograd Soviet. History shows that unless a government has control of its army, it does not hold real power. Order Number 1 made it clear that the provincial government did not have such power. It had, therefore, to compromise with the Soviet. Between February and April, this arrangement worked reasonably well. There was no serious disputes between the two bodies in the dual authority. An important factor that helped lessen party differences was the widespread elation in Petrograd in the weeks following the February Revolution. There was an excitement in the air. People on the streets greeted each other enthusiastically, as if a new era had dawned. This encouraged a genuine feeling across all political groups that Russia had entered a period of real freedom. For a time, cooperation between opposing parties became much easier to achieve. There was also a general acceptance that the new liberty that had come with the collapse of the Tsardom should not be allowed to slip into anarchy. This created a willingness to maintain state authority at the center of affairs. Furthermore, at the beginning, both the provisional government and the Soviet contained a wider range of political representation than later in times. Moderate socialists had a bigger influence than the social revolutionaries or the social democrats in the first meetings of the Soviet, while all parties, apart from the Bolsheviks and the monarchists, were represented in the provincial government during its early weeks. As the year wore on and problems mounted, the provisional government moved increasingly to the right and the Soviet increasingly to the left. But before the shift occurred, there had been considerable harmony. The fruits of this initial cooperation were shown in a set of progressive measures adopted by the provisional government: an amnesty for political prisoners, the recognition of trade unions, the introduction of an 8-hour day for industrial workers, the replacement of the czarist police with a people's militia, the granting of full civil and religious freedoms, and preparations for the elections of a constituent assembly. Noticeably, however, these changes did not touch on the critical issues of the war and the land. It would be these that would destroy the always tenuous partnership of the dual authority, and it would be Lenin who would begin the process of destruction. Special note, from this point on, we will refer to St. Petersburg as Petrograd. So once the exiled Bolsheviks learned of Nicholas's abdication, they rushed back to Petrograd. Those like Stalin, who had been in Siberia, were the first to return in March. Stalin's return was significant. Because of their standing in the party, he and his fellow returnee, Lev Kamenev, became the leading voices among the Petrograd Bolsheviks. Initially, this duo took an anti-Lenin line. Lenin, who did not reach Petrograd until nearly a month later, still tried to direct things from exiles. In his letters from afar, he urged that the war that Russia was fighting should be turned into a class war. Bolsheviks should infiltrate the armies of the combatant nations and encourage the soldiers to turn their weapons against their officers as the first step towards overthrowing their governments. Lenin also instructed the Bolsheviks not to cooperate with the provisional government or the other parties. Stalin and Kamenev ignored Lenin's instructions. On the war issue, they argued that the best policy was to press for international negotiations to be started. Stalin wrote to the Bolsheviks in Petrograd telling them to put pressure on the provisional government to announce its willingness to start peace talks at once. On the question of the Bolsheviks' relations with the provisional government, Kamenev insisted that circumstances made cooperation with it essential, at least for the time being, since it was genuinely struggling against the remnants of the old regime. As to the other parties, Kamenev believed cooperation with them made perfect sense. He backed a proposal that it was possible and desirable for the Bolsheviks to consider linking again with the Mensheviks. Clearly, at this juncture, there was a wide divergence of view between Lenin and the other two men. Interestingly, Kamenev appears to have been the dominant partner in his relations with Stalin, who later admitted that in the period before Lenin arrived, Kamenev dominated Bolshevik discussions in the Petrograd. What Kamenev was advancing and what Stalin went along with was often referred to as accommodationism. It was an approach that Lenin would totally reject once he was back in Petrograd. Lenin arrived in Petrograd on April 3rd. The manner of his return from Switzerland was a remarkable story itself. His wife recorded it. The moment the news of the February Revolution was received, Lenin was all eagerness to get back to Russia. As there were no legal ways of traveling, illegal ways would have to be used. But what ways? From the moment the news of the revolution was received, Lenin had no sleep. His nights were spent building the most improbable plans. Naturally, the Germans gave us permission to travel through Germany in the belief that revolution was a disaster to a country, and that by allowing them to return to their country, they were helping to spread the revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks, for their part, considered it their duty to bring about a victorious proletarian revolution. They did not care what the German bourgeoisie government thought about it. Her account was wholly accurate. In the hope that the Tsar would fall by the prelude to the collapse of the Russian armies, the German government arranged for Lenin to return to Russia in a sealed train across occupied Europe. Since the outbreak of war in 1914, Lenin's opponents had continually accused him of being in the pay of the German government. Their charge had weight. Between 1914 and 1917, the German Foreign Office had given regular financial support to Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the hope that if they achieved their revolutionary aims, they would pull Russia out of the war. As Lenin's wife observed, Lenin did not really care what the attitude of the Germans was. It just so happened that, for quite different reasons, what they wanted, the withdrawal of Russian armies from the war, was precisely what he wanted. However, it made no difference to anti-Bolsheviks that the German reasons were militarily and Lenin's were political. They considered the German government and the Bolshevik Party to be cooperating in a common cause, the defeat of Russia. There is no doubting the great significance of Lenin's return to Petrograd in April 1917. Before then, the Bolsheviks, led by Kamenev and Stalin, had accepted the events of February, leading to the formation of the dual authority as part of a genuine revolution. They had been willing to work with the other reformist parties. Lenin changed all of that. In his speech on his arrival at Petrograd's Finland station on April 3rd, he declared that February had not been a genuine revolution. Far from giving Russia political freedom, it had created a parliamentary bourgeoisie republic. He condemned the provisional government and called for its overthrow in a second revolution. The following day he issued his April thesis, in which he spelt out future Bolshevik policy. To the bewilderment of the Bolsheviks, who had been in Petrograd since February and expected to be praised for their efforts in working with the other revolutionary groups, Lenin condemned all that happened since the fall of the Tsar. He insisted that, since the Bolsheviks were the only true revolutionary proletarian party, they must abandon all cooperation with other parties, work for the true revolution entirely by their own efforts, overthrow the provisional government, which was simply the old class-ridden Duma in a new garb, struggle not to extend freedom to all classes, but to transfer power to the workers, and demand that authority pass to the Soviets. Lenin had ulterior motives in demanding the Soviets take over the government. Although he rejected much of what they had done, he saw the Soviets as a power base. In practice, they had become an essential part of the structure of post-Tsarist government. Lenin calculated that the Soviets, and the Petrograd Soviet in particular, offered his small Bolshevik party the means by which it could obtain power in the name of the proletariat. If it could infiltrate and dominate the Soviets, the Bolshevik Party would be in a position to take over the state. The essence of Lenin's argument was summed up in two provocative Bolshevik slogans: peace, bread, and land, and all power to the Soviets. But these were more than slogans. They were Lenin's way of presenting in simple, dramatic headings the basic problems confronting Russia. Peace, which was a continuing war with Germany; bread, the chronic food shortage; and land, the disruption in the countryside. He asserted that as long as the provisional government stayed in power, these problems could not be solved because the ministers governed only in the interest of their own class. They had no wish to end the war, which brought them profits, to supply food to the Russian people, whom they despised, or reform the land-holding system, which guaranteed their property rights and privileges. That is why Lenin wanted all power to the Soviets. The current ministers must be swept aside and replaced with a government of the Soviets. Only then would the people's needs be addressed. Lenin's analysis was perceptive. The provisional government's failure to deal with the three principal issues he had identified was indeed to prove its eventual downfall.